Hello, everyone. Let's start with our discussion of our first Anubhav paper for 2026. I'm Aditya Jagtap. I'll be discussing the passages, the verbal section with you. Uh, those of you who are new to the approach that we have, those of you who haven't done classes with me, uh, and those of you who have done classes with me, I'll just like to highlight two things before we proceed first. One is remember that we approach any passage, all passages, in a stepwise fashion, right? And there are certain steps we take. The kind of steps we take are going to determine our accuracy. And for each passage, we have certain question types. Those of you who are new may not know how we have grouped the questions, but we have grouped them into inference, assumption, main point, etc., etc. So for each question type, there's a specific method that we have. The closer we stay to the method and the stepwise fashion, the more predictable our accuracy. So, and the more accurate we are. If we stray away from the method or the stepwise fashion, our accuracy reduces, it becomes erratic, it becomes more like guesswork. Okay. So, I'll highlight the method and I'll highlight the stepwise fashion every time it's relevant. So let's proceed with the first question. I have some colors that I'm using to actually mark the passage. Our papers are printed. Those of you who have taken the exam in printed form, especially in UPSC, will be a printed paper. So you want to remember that we should mark every passage in a specific way. So the objective, the first stepwise objective that we have is before we proceed to the options, especially, right? Before we proceed to this section, I want to make sure that I know what this is. I want to finish my complete understanding of the main point of the author at this stage. The main point should be absolutely clear. The reason being, like I've discussed in class, this part of the material we can fully trust, whereas this part of the material we cannot trust. The question, the options are possible traps. So first we have to figure out the main point of the passage. I've marked the passage in a way where we'll understand the main point. Your marking can be slightly different, that's all right. Then I specifically know what kind of question it is and what is expected out of me. And then I proceed through each option. Uh, when I told you being methodical matters, for every option, for every decision, if I say option one is correct or option two is wrong, there should be some specific words or phrases which tell me what is right or wrong. This should not be based on how an option sounds to me, if it sounds correct or incorrect. This is a really bad approach. That's because examiners know our tendency to select options based on how they sound, and tricky options are created. And so we have to use evidence. We have to use specific words or phrases to determine our decisions. Okay. So let's start with the first passage. Here, if you notice, a recurring challenge lies in mismatch of technological change. So technological change is fast and regulations are slower. Now, about the kind of regulations one should make, the author tells us blanket restrictions, matlab total restrictions, will affect innovation. Inaction, if the regulator is inactive, that will allow private actors to not act in a legal way or not act in a moral way. Recent policy debates have emphasized principles based regulation. Principle based regulation has been defined for us here, focusing on transparency, auditability, personal accountability, rather than rigid rule making. However, governance frameworks that rely excessively on self regulation assume that market incentives will align with public interest. So, the author is trying to say the challenge is a mismatch between technological change ka speed and regulations ka speed. And in the remaining part of the passage, the author is telling us how the regulator should act. The regulator should not do blanket restrictions. The regulator should not be inactive. Principles based regulation is effective, but only to a certain degree, because you can't assume that the market will always act in the interest of the public. Okay. Now, based on these, we want to figure out what is a valid inference. If you notice, I've highlighted only this part. These words don't matter. Uh, Whenever I have a question stem that is relevant, I'll discuss which words matter. We only focus on the word inference here. Inference means we use some evidence in the passage to come up with a fresh conclusion. Okay. Fresh conclusion means that conclusion that you've drawn, that we have drawn, is not existent in the original material. Okay. So that's the textbook definition of inference. In application, it sort of changes sometimes slightly, but we have to stick to that approach. That what we understand inferences to be. Those are conclusions we draw based on evidence. Okay. Let's look at one. Regulatory frameworks must adapt continuously to technological change. Now, we know regulatory frameworks and technological change have been discussed in the passage. Must adapt continuously has not been directly stated, right? But there is a specific word or phrase in the passage that helps me accept this. So notice I'm not simply accepting it based on how it sounds, but because I know it's a recurring challenge, I know they must adapt continuously. This is an ongoing process that is always going on, therefore recurring. So, must adapt continuously is a valid inference. Statement 1 is a valid inference. Statement 2 says rigid regulatory actions allow private technological power to operate without accountability. Okay. Now, rigid regulatory actions, these are mentioned in the passage here rather than rigid rule making. Okay. Now, we will go back to the passage and remember, never answer questions based on memory. We are treating this like a bar graph question. We always go back to the graph to answer. We never answer based on memory. So I go back to the passage and I see that this has been mentioned as not good, emphasizing principle based regulation rather than rigid rule making. So recent policy actions prefer principle based regulation rather than rigid rule making. But what are the negative outcomes of rigid rule making? Does it allow private players to operate without accountability? This has not been stated, right? Nowhere has it been stated that rigid rule making will allow them to operate without accountability. So this conclusion about rigid regulatory actions cannot be drawn. So therefore, 2 is an invalid inference. So if 1 is valid, 2 is invalid, we still need to check for statement 3 here. Okay. Uh, when it comes to technological change, market incentives may not always be aligned with public interest. So market incentives may not always be aligned with public interest. This is a valid conclusion drawn from the last line. Market incentives will align with public interest is a, is a assumption, right? So this is an assumption, means this may not always be true. Therefore, the word assumption has been used. So 3 is a valid inference. So we have 1 and 3 as the correct answer. Option C. So what I want you to make a note of is for may not always be aligned, I found assume, and for must adapt continuously, I found recurring challenge. So none of this is based on how something sounds to me. None of this is based on guesswork. It's evidence based. Okay. Uh, so we have our first inference question. Let me discuss some other question types now. Question 2 is an assumption question. Uh, in this question, we are discussing developing countries, the saying that climate action cannot be delinked from developmental priorities. They are interlinked, right? Uh, Financial constraints. Now we are talking about developing countries have financial constraints and it affects their ability to transform. Whereas rich countries, donor countries, face political pressures. By the way, this idea that developing countries cannot take climate related action and rich countries should pay developing countries is a common theme in UPSC CSAT passages. Almost every year you'll get one passage which sort of refers to this, at least one passage which sort of refers to this theme. Okay, that doesn't mean you have to solve based on memory. You still have to analyze the passage. Okay. Uh, so we are told attempts to frame climate finance purely as technical is it obscures its distributive nature. So it makes it unclear that climate finance is actually distributive in nature. So the last line actually simplifies what is stated here. Sustainable climate cooperation depends on fulfilling financial responsibilities, right? So this applies to the rich countries trying to pay for water they've promised. So fulfilling financial responsibilities based on the information. So this is the main point which I've figured out now. Uh, and now I'll proceed to the assumptions and checking whether the assumptions are valid or not. Now, the example for assumptions that I provide is that A tells B, go to the market and buy vegetables. So listen carefully, go to the market and buy vegetables. That means B, so A tells B, go to the market and buy vegetables. That means B knows the way to the market. To the market. So this would be B knows the way to the market would be a valid assumption. It's underlying the original passage. So valid assumption is underlying the original passage. It's located within the information, right? Whereas this inference that we made was located outside. It was a fresh conclusion we made. But an assumption is located inside the passage. It's supporting the passage. Okay. No one ever in the exam is going to ask you the distinction between inference or assumption, but just for clarification, I like to provide that. Okay. So, in an assumption, I can actually add the word not to a valid assumption, and the passage will then not be supported. The passage will fall apart. We'll check this. Let's look at the first statement. Climate commitments lack credibility in the absence of reliable financial support mechanisms. Now, I want to check if this assumption is valid. I know it's related to the passage. Climate commitments and credible climate commitments are discussed here. Financial flows are not merely economic transfers, they shape trust and credibility. So, financial flows affect credibility, right? So, climate commitments lack credibility in the absence of financial support. If I said climate commitments do not lack, if I add the word do not lack here, do not lack credibility in the absence of reliable financial support, this part, financial flows are not merely economic transfers, they shape trust and credibility. This part would fall apart. This part of the passage would stop making sense. So, statement 1 is a valid assumption. This assumption is underlying this part of the passage and it supports that part of the passage. If I remove this valid assumption, the passage will fall apart. So for assumptions, we have this kind of a test. Statement 1 is a valid assumption. Statement 2, developmental needs and climate goals are inherently in tension for developing countries. Now, I believe statement 2 is going to cause some problems. Some students will go with option D here. So developmental needs and climate goals are inherently in tension. I want to check whether this is a valid assumption made from the passage for developing countries. So notice that I'm using a specific word or phrase. I'm not simply deciding based on how it sounds. The first line says developing countries argue that climate action cannot be delinked, means cannot be separated from developmental priorities. So developmental priorities and climate goals are inherently in tension, cannot be separated or cannot be delinked means we can say that they are mutual priorities or they are dual priorities or both are important. But what I cannot say is both are inherently in tension. Inherently in tension mean both naturally act against each other. That's what inherently in tension would mean. If you notice, if these developing countries get financial support, these are not inherently intention. They can be mutually pursued. They can both be pursued at the same time. So they're not inherently intention. They are always linked. They cannot be delinked, but they're not inherently intention. This is not a valid assumption I can make, right? So statement 2 is invalid. Again, if you want, you can go back and listen to this part. Delinking is about them both being interconnected, them both being mutual goals, dual goals. Inherently intention means they're both acting against each other. That is not an inherent necessity. Okay, let's look at statement 3. Short term or project based climate finance is insufficient for sustaining long term international cooperation. All right. So short term finance is insufficient. Let's look at the words here. We are told sustainable cooperation depends on fulfilling financial responsibilities. Mm. So here, political pressures that constrain long-term financial commitments, leading to preference for short-term project-based funding. So short-term is not good. It constrains long-term financial commitments, means the passage expects long-term financial commitments for climate projects to work out. So short-term finance is insufficient. If I said short-term finance is not insufficient, if I added the word not here, this part of the passage would fall apart. Mm, Without predictable and adequate finance climate commitment. So predictable, adequate also refers to sort of some kind of trust being there, refers to some kind of long-term commitment. So multiple parts of the passage would stop functioning if I removed option 3. So 1 and 3 are valid, which leaves us with only option B here. There's no other option we can go with. But nevertheless, 4, climate finance arrangements influence political and relational outcomes. So this entire thing about domestic political pressures leading to commitments, leading to XYZ. So it will affect political outcomes. It will affect the relationships with other countries as well. And this is beyond the monetary support. So option B is the right answer here. If I added the word not to any of these, 1, 3, and 4, they would fall apart. All right. Now, what I want you to again quickly notice before we proceed to the next question is that I'm usually, this is not always the case, but usually we want to pay attention to phrases and words that quantify or measure things. Okay. Because these are often used by the author. Again, I said often, not always. These are often used by the examiner to create options, and these can be correct or incorrect. So that's one tip for all of you all to keep in mind. Those of you who attended the classes know this, that we pay attention to quantifying or measuring words and phrases which quantify or measure things. Here, credibility is measured. Here, tension is measured, right? Okay. Uh, let's look at passage 3. It's an inference question. Design choices embedded within digital platforms. So digital platforms make some design choices while building them, can unintentionally exclude population. So they may end up excluding some parts of the population. These exclusions are often invisible to policymakers. They may not see this because system performance is assessed through aggregate success rates. So policymakers just look at system performance through aggregate success. Centralized digital infrastructures introduce risks. So if you have one single digital infrastructure, there will be a risk which will affect large population bases simultaneously. Now, looking at digital infra as a neutral enabler is not a good idea. Without conscious institutional safeguards, digitization may be bad. So, if you don't have conscious safeguards on digital platforms, digitization may not be helpful to people. Okay, passage is fairly easy. We know we are looking for fresh conclusions that can be made from the passage. One says aggregate performance metrics may systematically conceal exclusion. experienced by specific user groups. We know aggregate performance metrics and exclusion has been discussed in the passage here. These exclusions, etc., often invisible because system performance is assessed. So I need to check if this is systemic and if it may conceal exclusion. Concealing exclusion is valid. These exclusions often invisible, so conceal is valid because system performance is assessed through aggregate success rates. uh, there's one more part which refers to systemic problems. Moreover, centralized digital infrastructures introduce systemic risks, right? And this systemic risk is going to affect large populations. So again, aggregate performance metrics may systematically and aggregate systems. Centralized digital infrastructures are aggregate systems which will have metrics, may systematically conceal exclusion. So this has been repeated in two sentences, we can say from the passage, definitely from one sentence. So one is valid. Two says centralized digital systems may amplify governance inefficiency by minimizing dependence on human discretion. There are two phrases actually, amplifying governance inefficiency, which will tell you that two is invalid. Nowhere have we discussed amplifying or increasing government inefficiency in the passage. And minimizing human discretion has nowhere been discussed in the passage at all. So, 2 is invalid. Excuse me. Okay, so 1 is valid, 2 is invalid. That leaves us with A or D. So we can actually quickly check 4 in the exam. This is the kind of approach that I would like you to use in the exam if you want to save time. Automated decision-making mechanisms are inherently more contestable than discretionary human judgment. So again, inherently is a word that you'll come across maybe twice in the exam at least, you use quite frequently. Inherently more contestable than discretionary human judgment. This again, this comparison that they're always more contestable is invalid. If you notice, digitization may replace discretionary human judgment, but it will reshape governance in ways that are difficult. So it's not inherent. It may, if allowed, it may do this, right? May replace. So it's not inherent. So 4 is invalid. So if 4 is invalid, you go with option A. Now, if you'd use this approach, you would have saved some little time. If you notice, some of you may have noticed this, that in today's the first Anubhav paper, we have many questions with multiple statements. And this is what we are seeing being done by UPSC, and especially being difficult for some students when questions have multiple statements. Whenever questions have multiple statements, you want to use the options carefully, but in your favor, so that you can solve questions quickly. So we can go with option A without actually seeing option 3. Option 3 is valid. Digitization can alter power relations in unintended ways because it excludes people, it creates biases and affects large populations, etc. So it will affect power relations. It's a valid conclusion. A is the right answer. Okay, let's look at this assumption question. Let's look at, if you notice, for every small passage, we have a small passage. Small meaning, what I mean by small passage, it has only one question. In the case of a small passage with one question only, always look at the question stem first. This is the question stem. This is the question stem. This is a part of the stepwise process. So since I've looked at the question stem first, I know what is expected out of me when I'm reading the passage. This does not work for questions which have more than passages which have more than one question. Okay. Let's start with the passage. Constitutional systems grant executives discretionary authority to respond to crises. This authority flexibility is justified using uh, repeated reliance on this kind of decision making, discretionary decision making, is a risk. This can weaken institutional checks and legality may persist. So it's discretionary authority, so it's legal. So legality may persist. even as democratic norms erode. So you continue to take discretionary decisions instead of using the democratic structure that leads to it being legal but not fully democratic. Democratic resilience depends on written provisions and sustained adherence to restraint. Okay, so passage is talking about not overusing discretionary authority. Let's look at statement one. We're looking for assumptions. If you, assumption should be underlying the passage, it should support the logic of the passage. Repeated executive use of discretionary power can alter democratic practice without formal legal change. Legality may persist as democratic norms erode. If I said cannot here, if I use the word cannot, this part of the passage would fall apart. So, statement 1 is a valid assumption because it is necessary to support this part of the passage. It's a necessary, valid underlying assumption. Statement 2, written constitutional safeguards alone are sufficient to preserve democratic resilience. It's not alone sufficient. You need adherence to restraint. So people should follow them. Simply having safeguards is not enough. So alone are sufficient is invalid. A is the right answer. Okay. Uh, Again, notice that I'm paying attention to quantifying or measuring words or phrases. Right? These words or phrases are quantifying or measuring something in the option or in the passage. A is the right answer here. Let's see the next one. Uh, this is the next set. Now, corollary is a question stem which is it's an old question stem, but in the past 4 years, UPSC has been asking it slightly more. So maybe expect 2 or 3 questions of these. Uh, Three would be on the more side. Corollary is a it's a conclusion. It's a subset of inference questions. So corollary is a subset of inference questions, but it's a specific subset, meaning that corollary follows. Uh, I'll actually define it using the option. Okay, so the passage is talking about opposition derives legitimacy from what actions? It derives legitimacy from sustaining institutional equilibrium. So opposition is supposed to balance the ruling party, in short, by challenging executive narratives and essentially challenging arbitrariness. However, when opposition movements frame governance as a moral struggle, so now the author is telling us, however, when opposition makes this a moral struggle, the differences between the parties become irreconcilable, meaning their differences cannot be settled. So, if opposition treats their role as a moral arbiter, that's not a good thing. Democracies survive because acceptance of procedural limits. So democracies survive because both the opposition and ruling party are both they're sharing acceptance of procedural limits. Okay. Now a corollary is a conclusion that follows the logic of the passage. So there is some specific logic in the passage. And inference, if you notice, there are four inferences here, right? Of which we are saying two are valid. An inference can be made from any part in the passage, right? That's what an inference is. A corollary is a subset of inferences, and it's made from a specific logical part of the passage, right? It's not made across the passage anywhere in the passage. It's made from a specific logical part of the passage. So let's look at statement one. Survival of democracies requires opposition to contest arbitrariness without rejecting constitutional procedures. So survival of democracies, this is justified based on here, democracies survive. Uh, Not because XYZ, they survive because of all of these. So democracy survive requires, right? So this is necessary, requires opposition to contest arbitrariness. So the opposition is supposed to contest arbitrariness by challenging arbitrariness. So a specific logical part of the passage has been taken and a related conclusion has been drawn. That's a corollary. So a corollary is a subset of an inference question. It's looking at us trying to make a specific association from the passage and it should follow the association in the passage. Option A is the right answer. There are a few more corollary questions which will help us clarify this further. Uh, electoral defeat, one second. Electoral defeat weakens the legitimacy of opposition parties in democracies unless they adhere to constitutional decorum. So, electoral defeat weakens. If you notice here, electoral performance has been mentioned. Opposition parties often derive legitimacy from electoral performance. This has been mentioned, but it's not dependent upon unless they adhere to constitutional decorum. So this is not a binary choice that only if they do this or they can do that. So this, unless they adhere to constitutional decorum, makes their legitimacy a binary choice between electoral success and constitutional decorum. This is not a binary choice mentioned in the passage. Both are simply mentioned together in the passage. B is invalid. C says moral framing enhances accountability. It actually reduces accountability, right? Because they simply make it a irreconcilable argument between the parties, an irreconcilable confrontation. So we can't say enhances. Again, a quantifying word or phrase, these are invalid. Whereas a quantifying word or phrase here, these are valid. So we have to specifically focus on those, especially. They many times will be the reason for the answer being right or wrong. Institutional equilibrium depends primarily on executives' willingness to exercise restraint. Depends primarily. Again, a quantifying word or phrase. This is invalid. Does not depend primarily on executives' willingness. We are discussing in the passage the actions taken by the opposition, not exactly the actions taken by the executive here. So D is invalid. We can make conclusions about the executive, but that wouldn't be a corollary here. A is the right answer. The thing that I want all of you to remember is, if you felt A is right, this is not a question like this where I can skip testing one of the options. I have to make sure I go through all the other options and make sure they're invalid. Okay. This has to be an elimination based process. Has to be an elimination based process. Okay. Most valid implications for India's metropolitan cities. If you notice, this is the first time I'm actually marking all the words here. Uh, let's let's go through the passage. Then I want to discuss the word implication once. I was just thinking about how to approach this, because some students who have not done classes with me may find this completely new. Uh, Cumulative emissions of traffic pollutants significantly elevate incidence of diseases. So emissions and traffic pollutants increase diseases. Traffic congestion will increase fuel consumption, make everything inefficient. It will make the economy inefficient. Long-term traffic congestion raises costs, leads to waste, diminishes economic vitality. Recognizing these multifaceted impacts, establishing sustainable transport systems is imperative. Another word UPSC will throw around a lot, as a key strategic measure to safeguard human health. So, recognizing these factors caused by long term traffic congestion is key. Okay. Now, most valid implication for India's metropolitan cities. There are two times in the question, two ways in which the word implied or implication is used. Okay. When you say the view implied, okay, please make a note of this. When you get something like view implied, it's what we understand a regular implication to be. For those of you who don't know what a regular implication is, it's just an inference. Okay. It's suggested by the passage. So it's a conclusion that is being suggested by the passage. That's what a implication is. Most valid implication, or rather the words practical implication. are different. Okay, those questions which will say practical implication especially are different. So we'll soon see what they are. A says fuel efficiency can drastically reduce congestion. This is not discussed that fuel efficiency can drastically reduce congestion. This is a invalid implication that the passage has not made at all. So A is invalid. B says expansion of road infrastructure is essential to offset economic losses. These are also quantifying words. But expansion is essential to offset. Offset means to balance economic losses. This has not been mentioned in the passage at all. So B is invalid. C says traffic related impacts must be addressed independently of urban economic planning. So traffic impacts are independent of urban planning. This is actually opposite of what the passage was saying. Traffic impacts affect urban planning. So A, B, C are invalid. D is the right answer. To ensure future economic productivity, current urban transport plans must prioritize systemic congestion reduction. So recognizing these is key strategic measure to safeguard human health, to ensure future economic productivity. So this will affect economics also. Uh, Economic development has been mentioned here. So to ensure economic productivity, current urban transport plans must prioritize systemic congestion reduction. Okay. So D is the right answer. Now, what I want you to notice is most valid implication is the same as view implied. UPSC has asked both of these questions before. Okay. Asked questions these two ways before. And both of these expect us to make a implication based understanding. Oh, this is something the passage suggests. B is right. D is something the passage suggests. Now, this brings us to practical implication question type, which is different. Okay. Which is also asked in the exam and which is asked in our today's paper. So, we'll revisit question 12 shortly. I want to discuss the practical implication question type as compared to this question type soon. Okay. Best sums up. We are trying to make a summary from of the passage. Now, summary means I'm trying to pick an option, let's say option E, such that if option E is right, it can be a acceptable replacement of the passage. I can throw away the full passage and it would still be contained to an acceptable degree in option E. That's what we are trying to do. So we are in a way trying to replace the passage. This is important. This understanding is important. I'll explain why. In the passage, we are told rising dependence on chemical fertilizers, pesticides has affected soil fertility and sustainability, and farming costs have steadily increased. The use of traditional biofertilizer, uh, a list is given to us, is beneficial if farmers begin with 1 acre one season of using biofertilizers. The outcomes can build confidence for larger adoption. So the author is suggesting that if you use traditional biofertilizers in a small way, and if the outcomes are good, it can inspire larger adoption, which can work as a possible solution against rising dependence on chemicals. Right? Possible solution. Okay. Now, I can take a simple fact from the passage, right? Let's take the first line, just the first sentence, and give this as option E, as it is. Now, suppose an option from the passage appears in the exam, and it's stated accurately, just like it was stated in the passage, it's stated accurately. That doesn't make option E the correct summary. The summary has to The summary has to include the author's main point, which is why the author spoke to us. The summary has to include any facts or opinions given by the author in an accurate way. In short, the summary has to replace the full passage. So, just having a factually right option is not a summary. That's why we think of a valid summary option, such as option C, as an attempt to replace the full passage. Okay, the best possible attempt to replace the full passage. We never get ideal options, by the way. All options are problematic in summary and main point questions. A says natural farming offers a low cost alternative to large scale chemical agriculture by reviving traditional farming inputs. Uh, so, natural farming offers a low cost alternative to large scale. If you notice, traditional biofertilizers are discussed. So there are a few problems here. Traditional biofertilizers specifically are not the same as natural farming. Natural farming may include traditional biofertilizers, but traditional biofertilizers is not the same as natural farming. Offers a low cost alternative. Low cost alternative has been mentioned here. Lowered input costs have been mentioned here, right? But these are not the same. To large scale chemical agriculture. Large scale chemical agriculture has not been discussed anywhere in the passage. Chemical agriculture has been discussed, or rather, chemical fertilizer using agriculture has been discussed. But large scale chemical fertilizers के लिए alternative है is invalid. We don't know if this will scale up to large scale. It may inspire larger adoption, but we don't know if it's an alternative to large scale chemical use. So A is invalid. The main point of the author is not expressed accurately. B says when traditional wisdom, scientific validation, and institutional support come together, natural farming can become feasible and transformative. I know many students would have gone with option B. Scientific validation is not mentioned in the passage. Institutional support is not mentioned in the passage. And when they come together, natural farming can become feasible and transformative. Uh, Feasible, possible, transformative, unknown. Again, we don't know to what degree this is going to change everything. It will benefit, yes, but is it going to transform agriculture? Unknown. So main point of the author mixed up again, not given accurately. These are not mentioned in the passage. So factual inaccuracies and main point incorrect. For a summary question, I have exact reasons for elimination of an option. I want you to use the same so that way you know why options are valid and invalid. So again, if you notice, I'm being extremely methodical and I'm making sure that I have evidence for my decisions, right? Whatever is valid, I have some evidence. Whatever is invalid, I have some evidence. Evidence means I have words or phrases I can point to. Okay, let's look at option C. Gradual adoption of natural farming practices can reduce farmers' risks from climate variability and rising costs. So, can reduce farmers' risks. This is firstly great. It doesn't say it will transform anything. So, this works. Gradual adoption is 1 acre, 1 season of natural farming practices. Natural farming practices, by the way, are mentioned here. So I can say natural farming, but natural farming in general can be used. Here, when I say as a low cost alternative, that does not mean traditional. So when I said natural farming is not traditional here, I'm talking about not this use, but the specific used in the specific use in the passage. Because here I'm discussing it as a possible solution, not as an alternative, right? That's why I'm focusing on this and not this for option A. But for option C, we can actually use the natural farming practices because they can reduce. It's not a complete transformative altering thing, but it can help, it can benefit. So C is a valid summary. D is invalid because it says has compelled farmers to explore in environmentally sustainable. It hasn't compelled. If you notice, we are trying to inspire them. This is an invalid option. Again, in a summary question, you want to make sure that you're eliminating each option and only then accepting a choice. C is the right answer. Let's move along a little faster. The question types are clear to everyone. This is an assumption question and it's talking about how the market is valuing AI-led companies. It's overvaluing AI-led companies. Okay. Option 1 says current stock market valuation in the AI sector are driven more by expectation than present earnings. We are told market rallies because of the story. So driven more by expectations than earnings, what will happen in the future? One is valid. If I said are not driven, if I added the word not here, the passage would fall apart, right? Or rather, this part of the passage would stop making sense. So one is a valid assumption. Two says investor behavior in financial markets is influenced by dominant narratives. I know many of you have gone with option some other option because you felt 2 is invalid, right? So maybe you went with option B because of that. But investor behavior in financial markets is influenced by dominant narratives, the story. Uh, before also, AI led euphoria. They believe that AI led euphoria and it will continue. And they're pumping billions of dollars. So investor behavior is influenced by dominant narratives or stories. We know this based on euphoria and story mentioned here, right? If I said is not influence, these parts of the passage would fall apart. So 1 and 2 are valid. 3 says heavy investment in AI by leading companies signals. By the way, if you have 1 and 2, right? What I expect all of you to do, just remember 1 and 2. I just expect you to look at option. You can actually just quickly look at option 4 and 3. There's no real benefit here. Option 4 says market rallies may not accurately reflect overall economic fundamentals. This is valid. Fundamentals are mentioned here. May not accurately is great. Heavy investment signals long-term profitability. Nothing in the passage is talking about something X signals long-term profitability. This is invalid. In fact, here we are told pumping billions of dollars is actually not good. It's based on AI-led euphoria. So 3 is invalid. D is the correct answer. All right. So assumptions are underlying the passage. They support the logic of the passage. If I remove a valid assumption, it would make the passage fall apart. Okay. D is the right answer. Let's see the next one. We're looking at inferences. Here we are talking about India's macros, India's economic fundamentals being strong. They're listed to us. And that makes India a good investment destination, right? Where capital erosion is unlikely. And if you move capital to debt. Now, one of the things is, and economics passages and other technical passages can give us some problems, is moving capital to debt. Here, some kind of investment in bonds has been discussed. We may not know what bonds are. We should know, but there may be a phrase that UPSC gives us which we don't know what it is. So, you want to make sure that at least some part of the passage you've understood really well. And for every other part of the passage, you have some evidence to navigate around things you may not know. Okay. Uh, so investing in these bonds would be a very wise decision in today's market because there is no capital erosion and you still get some return. So I know investing in these government bonds or corporate bonds is a good thing. I'll get some decision, I'll get some return, and I'll not face erosion of my funds. Okay. So let's look at question 21. It's an inference question. All right. So what I was talking about was what I was talking about was that even if you have some parts of the passage which you don't understand or they become technical, and you just understand one specific aspect of it, it's enough to navigate around the complexity of what bonds are, how they give returns, if it's uh, you know periodic, if it's certain, uncertain return, if it's etc. So uh, let's see how we can use those and figure out what the right option is. And again, we have 5 statements. This is what we'll see mostly in the yes in this year's paper. India's relative macroeconomic stability reduces downside risk for conservative investors. Now, India's relative macroeconomic stability, this is true, reduces risk. So no capital erosion, where capital erosion is unlikely. Uh, so reduces risk for downside. We may not know what downside is. Downside just means outcome or eventual risk for conservative investors. Now, some of you have eliminated option 1 as valid because this is for conservative investors. This would apply. India's relative macroeconomic stability reduces risk for investors. If it applies for investors, then it applies for conservative investors as well. For sure, it right? It definitely applies then for conservative investors. So one is a valid inference despite using this phrase. Two says instruments in India currently offer returns comparable to long-term equity averages. We may not know if bond, even though capital to debt is written, we may not know if bonds are considered as debt instruments. From the passage, we can tell they are. But in short, the phrase debt instruments may cause people to have some problem. Like, I don't know what this is, how to answer this. But offer returns comparable. No, this is a quantifying order phrase. No comparable returns are discussed in the passage that X is comparable to Y, right? Nothing comparable discussed in the passage to long-term equity, whatever that may mean. So 2 is definitely invalid. Now, if 1 is valid and 2 is invalid, you should mark this option here, right? And C is the right choice. You don't need to look at 4 or 5. But you have to have really specific and clear reasons why 1 is valid and 2 is invalid. 3 says global uh, political volatility has increased. So we are here told very good from a global perspective. And due to wars and political regime changes, there is volatility. So global political volatility has increased attractiveness of Indian assets. This is valid. And we have 4, which says strong corporate balance sheets eliminate risk. Nothing's just like comparable has not been made, elimination of risk has not been discussed in the passage. So 2 and 4 are invalid. 5 says diversified allocation of funds can lower portfolio volatility. Now, obviously, 1 and 3 are valid, 2 is invalid. We are sort of left with this choice only, but diversified allocation of funds in Indian bonds. So we are told two types of there are government bonds and Indian corporate bonds. And these are where there'll be no capital erosion and you'll still get some returns. So they can lower portfolio volatility without sharply reducing returns. Without sharply reducing returns just means you get some returns for sure. So C is the correct answer. All right. Based on this assumption question, the passage is talking about essentially international climate negotiations are framed as technical and oriented around emissions and mitigation. But this obscures, this mixes up, this covers the distributive nature of climate action. So again, the same sort of topic that we've seen before. Expect at least 2, 3 passages. Sometimes UPSC has 3 passages around the same topic of climate change and how countries find financing difficult. Opportunities are uneven across countries. Efforts to depoliticize these efforts fail because underlying inequalities remain unresolved. So to depoliticize the situation frequently fails because the inequalities between the countries, between people are still existent. When distributive conflicts are ignored, they tend to resurface as trade policy. So if climate, this is assumption, but an inference could be, this is an assumption question, a valid inference here could be that climate policy eventually may impact trade policy. That would be a valid inference, but we are discussing assumptions. Climate diplomacy, therefore, requires explicit responsibility and differential capacities. Passage type is well known, main point is clear. Let's take a look at the assumptions that can be underlying. One says climate negotiations inevitably involve political choices because they distribute costs. So I really, involving political choices is true, distribution costs is true. I really need to only check inevitably carefully. Does this happen for sure? So are often framed as technical. However, such framing obscures the fundamentally distributive nature. So it's inevitable. If it's fundamentally distribution of cost and allocation of cost is political, right? Then it inevitably involves political choices, right? If I said does not inevitably involve, so not inevitable, then this part and the part where politics is linked to it will then collapse. So one is a valid assumption. Two talks of standardized technical frameworks are sufficient to manage. This is invalid. If I said are not sufficient, it has no impact on the passage because 2 is a invalid assumption. 3 says past patterns of emissions and development continue to shape present day claims. So we are told historical responsibility and differential capacities. So past patterns of emissions continue to shape present day. This is valid. If I said don't continue, then this part, explicit engagement of historical responsibility, will fall apart. So 1 and 3 are valid, 2 is invalid. There's 1, 3, and 4 as well. So I need to check 4. Developing countries consider developmental priorities incompatible with undertaking. So this is invalid. It's not been stated as incompatible. A is the right choice. Okay. Now we have to compare practical suggestion, most valid practical suggestion or practical implication by the. So sometimes practical suggestion implied or practical implication from the passage. But the word is practical and implication. These, when these appear together, this is quite different from the question we saw earlier, question 12. Question 12 was a simple, what does the passage suggest? Okay, so here, when I say most valid implication or view implied, please make a careful note of this. Some of you may already be bored about the question type, but it's important because you're going to get at least 3 questions like this. Implication and view implied means what the passage suggests, what we can infer from the passage. But here, when we're talking about these words, practical and implied together, this is important for us to note because this is a relatively new question type. UPSC created in 2021, I think, is the first time it came up. Here, this is how we approach the question. Okay, we read the question, etc. We have one main point. Here, the main point is geranium plant can be transformed into biochar. Biochar is good. It has soil boosting qualities. It could reduce environmental impact, cut production costs, promote circular bioeconomy, improving crop yields, etc. in many regions across India. So these are the benefits of biochar. Fairly easy, right? Now, in a practical implication question, make a note of this. In a practical implication question where the word practical is associated, I am picking an option as if I represent the state with a capital S, right? State meaning I could be the government of India, I could be the judiciary, I could be, uh, you know, uh, the police organization, any arm of the state I could be, but I'm acting as the state. So think of the practical implication question like this. If I have this data, whatever this data is, we'll just call this some data, we'll call it input, right? If I have input 1, if I have input 1 and I am the state, I'm representing an arm of the state, what action should I take, right? What is the most practical action that I can take? So practical implication, again, is expecting us to take a practical action from the point of view of the state. We are representing the state with a capital S. Please make a note of this. I expect at least 3 practical implication questions. They're increasing in number. One of the papers had 4. Okay. So, A, geranium leaf waste, a mostly discarded byproduct, can be upcycled into a renewable fuel source. All of this is valid, can be upcycled, but it can be upcycled for its soil boosting qualities. Not, we don't know as a renewable fuel source or not. So as a state, I can't take this action. It may be of no value. Okay. Let's look at B. The geranium cycle process is low cost. This is not stated and is attractive to farmers. We don't know if the farmers will find it attractive. So if I am representing the state and I take this action, it would be illogical, not beneficial. C says farmers across the country can plant geranium, use it as natural fertilizer for crops. This would be valid except across the country. This is applicable only to many regions in India, right? So not across the country, only to many regions in India specifically. Uh, Again, if I'm the state and I have input one, we call the passage as input one. If I have input one and I use input one across the country, then I'm not using the input correctly. But if I am the state and based on input one, I set up geranium waste processing plants, this is going to help enhance soils and plant growth in India. Okay. So, a practical action implied by the passage that the state should take is setting up geranium waste processing plants. This can enhance soil and plant growth in India. So D is the right answer, but there's a larger learning that I want all of you to keep in mind. Whenever we get the words practical implication, we are acting as the state and we are choosing a option that the state will do if they have this input. But the fact that I wanted to remember and keep in mind is setting up geranium waste processing plants was nowhere discussed in the passage originally. This is not stated in the passage. This is not even a direct inference, but this is a logical, practical action that the state can take. So, whenever there is practical implication, think of it like a logical action, a practical action that the state can take, a responsible state can take. D is the right answer. I hope this is clear. Please revisit this because this is going to be helpful at some stage in your preparation process. Okay. Let's look at this question type. Now, I want you to identify question 24 as a separate thing. What I mean by that is every question type that we saw till now, practical implication, assumption, inference, assumption, etc., summary, best sums up, they are all standard question types, right? So when I notice the question stem first, when I read this question stem first, like I told you, I think of it like, oh, standard question type. But for question 24, I notice this is a non-standard question type. Non-standard means I need to process what the question is exactly asking me to do before I go to the options. So expect if you get around 28, 27 questions in the exam, expect at least 10 odd questions to be non-standard ones, where they ask the question in a non-standard way. So they don't throw a clear word out like, hey, find a assumption, find a inference, yeah, summary dhundo, main point dhundo. They won't give us a standard term like that. They'll ask it in a non-standard way. That means some processing time is required here. Please give that processing time, otherwise you'll end up selecting the wrong option as many of you would have done here if you don't process what is required. Okay. So the author would be least likely to support is what I'm looking for. मतलब passage में कुछ तो information दी है. On that basis, the author will support a few things, but there is one thing that the author will not support. That's the option that I'm looking for. The one that the author will not support. Okay. Now, in the passage, we are told behavior of least experience proved most sensitive to ethics. So, those who have least amount of experience are more sensitive to ethics training. Those who have experience uh, and a history of misconduct are less responsive. तो जिनको ऑलरेडी एक्सपीरियंस है, जिनको मिसकॉन्डक्ट ऑलरेडी जो मिसकॉन्डक्ट करते हैं, उनको एथिक्स ट्रेनिंग का कोई इम्पैक्ट नहीं होता. Often completely unaffected by ethics training. So, at the firm level, researchers suggest contagion of misconduct dampens ethics training. So, contagion of misconduct is talking about an atmosphere of misconduct will impair or reduce the effectiveness of ethics training. So, ethics training is effective for least experience or relatively effective for least experience. If someone has a history of misconduct, or if the organization has contagion of misconduct or disease of misconduct, their ethics training will not work as much. Okay. So, I'm looking for an option which would not be supported by the author of this passage. I'm looking for something that would not be supported. Okay. A says prioritizing ethics primarily for newly recruited. This is something for newly recruited which will work, right? The author will be like, okay, they're newly recruited, ethics training will work. Complementing ethics testing or training with firm level interventions addressing patterns of normalized misconduct. So let's simplify this to complementing ethics with addressing normalized misconduct. So if you complement ethics training and try to reduce contagion of misconduct, the author would be happy. If you try to do both these things. So B is something that the author would approve of. So it's not our answer. A and B are valid. They are not our answer. Valid in the sense the author would approve of them. C says relying on periodic ethics examinations as principal deterrent against all advisors. This is invalid because it won't impact those who have experience, those who already have history of misconduct. So the author would not approve of C. C is our answer. Targeting organizational culture reforms in clustered misconduct incidents. So firms which have contagion of misconduct present in them, they should be targeted with cultural reforms. This is something the author would support, right? But C, relying on periodic ethics for all advisors as principal deterrent is invalid. C is our correct answer. This the author would be least likely to support. So C is the right answer. It's relatively easy for us to understand. The more important thing that I wanted to remember, I'd spoken about being stepwise and methodical. Please make sure that the step here is that you spend some time processing what is expected by the question step. This step is necessary to be accurate. Okay. Let's look at question 31. We are looking at assumptions. Passages are fairly clear. Whenever passages require some explaining, I'll go through it carefully. I've marked the passages where if you read it in that fashion, transformation requires long-term investment, interconnectedness of the system. So I've marked the passages in a way where if you read the marked words, the main point will be clear. So some of you can pause and take a look at the words I've marked. Okay. So one says complex socioeconomic systems cannot be transformed through isolated duration interventions. So I need to check complex systems cannot be transformed through isolated duration. So cannot be transformed. Cannot be transformed is valid because systems transform requires long-term commitment, right? So long-term investment is required. Short-term cannot be transformed. So cannot be transformed is valid because requires is there. 2 says leadership, influence, and governance design, shape system-wide outcomes beyond individual policy measures. So leadership, influence, and governance shape outcomes. You need good leadership and enabling inclusive governance to participate in decision making. This is what will lead to effective transformation. So they do shape outcomes. Effective transformation is dependent on them. So 2 is a valid assumption. If I said leadership, influence, and governance don't shape, then this effective transformation part would fall apart. Okay. 3 says changes in institutional behavior precede and enable measurable improvements in system performance. So changes in institutional behavior precede, enable improvements. Changes in institutional behavior is again about this. And promoting certain types of tangible and intangible outputs, both of those. So 3 is valid. And 4 says quantifiable outputs alone are insufficient because we need intangible ones as well. We need tangible, meaning quantifiable things we can count, and intangible also things like thinking, relationships, etc. They are both required for deep structural transformation. So one alone is insufficient, is valid. Both are required. 5 says broad participation in decision making ensures successful outcomes. Nothing in the passage has spoken about ensuring success. So 5, wherever is present, would be invalid. The right answer is option C. Okay. If you notice, this is standard question type. This is non-standard question type. What has been proposed as policy implications for ensuring greater automation adoption in Indian agriculture? So some policy implications are proposed, and we want to pick the most practical ones. Practical implication. So it's a practical implication type. Here, it's pushed as non-standard, and here we realize that, oh, it's actually a standard question type, something UPSC has done again. So the questions that we have given in the exam, we have stayed extremely close to what UPSC has been doing in recent years. Expect 6 statements. Expect the question stem here to sometimes tell us whether it's standard or non-standard as well. We are told growers are cautious. We are talking about how new technologies, and taking up new technologies affects farmers. They are cautious because there are risks associated with it. Okay. So I want to check which of these are practical actions that the state can take, because it's practical implications. I'm acting as the state, right? So the state can do automation policies which prioritize farm level pilot projects that demonstrate consistent performance. This is valid. You need consistent performance, otherwise, the risk is too high if the performance is not consistent. So, one is valid. Two, government support should encourage rapid nationwide rollout of autonomous equipment to reduce hesitation. Now, if I'm the state and I'm encouraging rapid nationwide rollout of autonomous equipment, the risk is still high. They are still not, farmers are still not convinced. They may end up spending more time and effort for desired results. So, this won't work. Simply encouraging rapid nationwide rollout will not work unless the issues are addressed. Two is invalid. So one is valid, two is invalid. If you can figure that out, then these options are out of question, and you essentially only need to check option 4 or 5, one of these, right? 3 would become valid. 3 says automation technologies should be validated under real world farming conditions. Real world farming conditions proved more formidable. So if you're the state, if you're representing government of India, you should make sure that it's validated under real world farming conditions. This is a valid practical implication. So 3 is valid. 4 says risk mitigation mechanisms such as crop insurance incentives should be provided to farmers. Again, practical implication, I'm acting as the state. These words are not stated in the passage directly or indirectly, but it's a action a responsible state would take if growers face risks due to affecting ROI, real world conditions being different than lab conditions, etc. Right? So, risk mitigation should be protected by incentives, should be protected through insurance, etc. etc. 4 is a valid implication. 5 says public policy should prove labor saving automation will always improve. So prove will always improve. This is invalid. This is not suggested in the passage that it's possible also. So it's not an it's not an action that a responsible state should try to indulge in. 6 says buyback, replacement, or performance linked guarantee frameworks should be introduced to protect farmers. Now, what I wanted to know is, this is 6 is a little difficult for us to justify from the passage, but farmers should have frameworks that are introduced to protect farmers from faulty autonomous equipment. This part is absolutely valid. This is something a responsible state should do if you're encouraging new technologies. Right? But the important thing I want you to remember is, if you solve this part of the passage correctly, sorry, 1 and 2 correctly, and 4 and 5 correctly, you can come up with the right answer, right? So you can solve this much faster than whatever was the intended time. B is the correct answer here. Okay, we're looking at assumptions. One says India's maritime leadership in the Indian Ocean cannot be sustained through dominance or coercion alone. So we India's leadership cannot be sustained through dominance alone. So we need something else apart from dominance and coercion. So in the passage, we are told a balanced and realistic appraisal suggests that India can indeed shape the future of Indian Ocean. So their leadership in shaping the future of Indian Ocean by stewardship rather than hegemony. So not just by dominance alone, but by stewardship, by acting as the leader, by the protector, right? Grounded in mutual benefit. We are also told at the start of the passage that geopolitics requires it, right? Geography compels us to be a maritime power. So we need dominance because geopolitics requires it. We need some kind of protection because geography dictates it. But we also need stewardship and the role of a protector grounded in mutual benefit. So it cannot be sustained through dominance alone. This is valid. If I said it can be sustained through dominance alone, it would uh, nullify these parts of the passage. So option 1 is valid. Option 2 says external powers operating in the Indian Ocean will generally support India's rise. Generally support India's rise is invalid, we are told in the passage. The divergent trajectories of global south, India's leadership will be contested, always unfinished. So generally support would be invalid. The right answer here is option A. All right. Central idea is a main point question. We are trying to figure out what is the author's main point. Is the same passage, by the way. This passage had two questions. A says India's maritime future depends on synchronizing naval capability. Future depends on synchronizing naval capabilities. Invalid. This main point has not been suggested. Strategic competition in the Indian Ocean limits maritime ambition of any country. Invalid. The main idea of the passage is centered around India and its role as a guardian or a steward of the Indian Ocean. So any country is invalid. It's not going to be the central idea of the passage. C says India's maritime strategy seeks to balance ambition with realism. So balance realistic appraisal through cooperative regional stewardship. So cooperative regional stewardship is stewardship grounded in mutual benefit. C is the right answer. D says external political pressures are compelling India to recalibrate. So here, geography demands it, geopolitics requires it. So compels would be right, but it's not the central idea. The central idea is to tell us how India is approaching this, right? Or how India should approach this, not what is causing India to approach it. Right? There are multiple causes. There's one way that India should approach this. India can indeed shape by being a steward. So C is the right answer. Okay, we are looking at inference here, and we are talking about how persistent fiscal stress limits states' ability to respond to future shocks. So, how should the state pay for things? Should it borrow or should it earn to pay for things? That's what the passage is talking about. How should spending be? Spending should be efficient. We know this. A says government should prioritize reducing fiscal deficits even if investments are delayed. This is not stated in the passage. Invalid inference. D says fiscal stress arises primarily due to inadequate revenue, not mentioned in the passage. C says future economic shocks can be fully mitigated, completely invalid. So if you notice, all quantifying words or phrases in this case are invalid. A, C, and D. This borrowing can support is a quantifying word or phrase which is valid. Economic growth only when public spending is efficient. So borrowing is dependent on efficiency. Borrowing as a solution is dependent on its efficiency. B is the right answer. Okay. Let's take a look at question 42 is an assumption question. We are told how geographically India is prone to flooding. Now, especially, however, in recent years, urban centers and cities are prone to flooding. And we realize later in the second half of the passage, we are discussing not just urban flooding, but we are discussing the role of insurance or financial protection in the light of urban flooding. Okay, so this part of the passage becomes important, which we discover halfway through the passage. We're looking at assumptions. One says traditional flood management focused on major rivers are inadequate approaches. These approaches are inadequate for urban. This is valid because traditional is centered around river-based flooding. However, recent years, urban flooding is different. Urban flooding requires collaboration, requires insurance solutions. So traditional approaches are inadequate is a valid assumption. If I said they are adequate, the second half of the passage will stop making sense. It will fall apart. So one is a valid assumption. Two says structural financial risk transfer mechanisms are crucial part. So developing viable flood insurance solutions is necessary because we are told requires collaboration among. So while reinsurance sector can help, uh, it requires all of these factors um, across the insurance value chain. So structural financial risk transfer mechanisms are crucial part of building long-term resilience against urban flooding. Both one and two. If I said they're not a crucial part, the second half again would stop making sense. C is the right answer for question number 42. Question 43 best sums up. We are trying to replace the entire passage. The passage is the same, by the way. This is the same passage. This passage had two questions as well. To replace it, to summarize it, is to replace the full passage in a smaller way. A says urban flooding is driven by climate variability. This is not the summary should include something around you know risk planning, something that protects us from risk, right? Something that protects urban centers from risk. Preferably, the word financial or insurance would be better, but it's not given. If you notice, I had mentioned that we don't get ideal options. We need at least the word risk of urban centers being discussed. A is invalid. We can't say driven by climate variability. B says flood insurance markets must expand rapidly to cope with rising disaster related financial losses. So reinsurance sector can help, but many other things are required. Requires collaboration, requires planning, developing viable flood insurance solution, requires holistic forward looking risk assessment, flood catastrophe models, high quality data. Multiple things are required. So market expansion is not discussed as a possible solution. So B is invalid and not discussed as a possible solution, so therefore not a good summarization of the passage. D says major river flooding remains dominant challenge. So this is just talking about this part of the passage. It's completely invalid as the summary. C is the closest we have to a best possible summary. India's flood risk profile is evolving. It's changing from this river-based flooding to urban flooding, cities flooding around cities, requiring integrated urban resilience planning. So integrated because it requires all of these factors, multiple stakeholders, etc. And advanced risk assessment, high quality data, flood catastrophe models. C is the right answer. Again, not the best possible answer we can come up with, but best out of the given four. An ideal option should include the word insurance somewhere. Like if this had plus insurance somewhere mentioned, it would be close to the ideal choice. All right, C is the correct answer. Let's see the next one. This passage had three questions. The passage is, by the way, if you get a phrase like India's upstream energy sector, there's a good chance we don't know what this means. India's upstream energy sector is on the cusp of transformation. Government has introduced progressive reforms, simplify processes, exploration, etc. The reform will simplify processes through the amended ORD Act. We may not even know what the act is. The act also can be made up. The UPSC has done this very rarely. Okay. And this will do structural changes. So later I discover what upstream energy sector transformation is talking about, India's hydrocarbon transformation. India's hydrocarbon transformation potential remains largely untapped. It could also include other things that are mentioned in the passage. I'll tell you. Not only hydrocarbon reserves, also opportunities for carbon capture, geothermal energy, low impact. So I can assume, although it's not the most solid assumption, it's sort of based in me trying to put things together, that upstream energy sector includes these. Okay. Now I'm just trying to explain to you that if a phrase is unknown to you, how you can estimate its meaning. At least estimate it enough for us to go through all questions and options accurately. Okay. However, technology alone is not enough. We require solutions that are contextually relevant. Collaboration across the ecosystem must co-create solutions. So you need collaboration across the ecosystem, and all these people, scientists, specialists, engineers, etc., must all co-create solutions. Okay. Uh, Non-standard question type discussing potential challenges in fully utilizing India's hydrocarbon potential. What are the challenges? Why cannot we use India's hydrocarbon potential fully? This is going to be mostly through this part of the passage. One says persistence of underexplored acreage despite regulatory simplification. So underexplored acreage. One is valid. Two, fragmented subsurface data limiting integrated geological approach. So fragmented data has been discussed, complex geological data. All right. Three says over dependence on foreign capital restricting domestic exploration initiatives. If you notice, over dependence on foreign capital restricting domestic things has not been discussed anywhere. So three is going to be invalid. Okay. Let's look at four, misalignment between advanced digital tools and local geological contexts. And five says insufficient cross-sector collaboration. So one of the things is, I know many students have gone with option A here. Four is what we need to pay most attention to. Misalignment between advanced digital tools and local geological context. Now, for a moment, put aside the word misalignment. It's a quantifying or measuring word or phrase. So I know many of you circled it and probably eliminated option four. But we want to see the relationship between advanced digital tools and geological context, local or otherwise. Uh, the journey from rock to cloud is not just technological, it's a mindset shift. Exploration requires future energy development. AI, machine learning, cloud platforms are enabling scientists to interpret complex geological data with unprecedented precision. These tools are identifying hydrocarbon reserves and other reserves. But technology alone is not enough, needs solutions which are contextually relevant. So, contextually relevant allows me to say local geological contexts need advanced digital tools, right? Because they have to be contextually relevant. For local context, also, we need a specific advanced digital tool. If this is misaligned, if there is no tool for this relevant context, then the potential challenge will come up. So 4 is valid. Option 4 is valid. B is the correct choice for question number 51. I expect this to go wrong for many students. This is a slightly tricky question because of statement 4. Let's look at question 52, assumptions. One says regulatory reforms cannot truly unlock hydrocarbon potential without parallel technological and institutional shifts. So we are, despite these strides, India's hydrocarbon potential remains untapped because all of these interventions which are needed have not taken place. So it cannot truly unlock without us taking those actions. This is a valid assumption. If I said it can unlock, then this part of the passage that urgent interventions are needed would fall apart, right? So one is valid. Two says advanced digital tools can meaningfully expand India's energy options beyond hydrocarbons. So if you notice here, we are told are helping identify not only hydrocarbon reserves but also opportunities for carbon capture, geothermal energy, low impact alternatives. Now, again, I know many of you have uh, felt that option 2 is incorrect because of beyond hydrocarbons. Actually, the options here won't allow us to make any choice like this. Maybe some of you have gone with only one, but beyond hydrocarbons is acceptable, right? So one and two are definitely valid. Three says uniform solutions can be effectively applied across. No such thing has been mentioned anywhere in the passage. Three is unacceptable. C is the right answer for question number 52. One and two only. This is the last question from this passage. This passage had three questions. This is a main point question. Central idea means main point. Crux also means main point. Keynote, key idea. All of these mean the main point of the author. Main point means the author has one single message. That main message, we need to check which option best justifies. A says India's upstream energy is evolving through regulatory reform. and selective adoption of digital tools. Selective adoption of digital tools not mentioned in the passage. A is invalid. B says advances in subsurface data analytics are redefining. They should redefine. Urgent intervention is needed, but are redefining is incorrect. They could redefine or should redefine. Are redefining is invalid. India's upstream energy transformation requires urgent intervention. So, regulatory reform, advanced technology, collaboration. C is the correct answer here. D says India is repositioning hydrocarbon exploration framework to align with broader. So, D, some of you would have marked based on just the first paragraph of the passage, but D is not the central idea. The central idea, remember this, that if the author is giving us some kind of a suggestion or solution, right here, this demands collaboration, urgent interventions are needed. In a ideal main point or summary question, I'm talking about two question types here. Main point, which is central idea, and summary, which is best sums up. In both these question types, if a solution or recommendation is made by the author, the ideal option should include the solution or recommendation. Requires, reform, requires, etc. etc. Just keep that idea in mind. C is the right answer here. Those of you who attended the classes would know exactly what I mean by problem solution passage type. Keynote, we're again looking at main point. The passage here is talking about how employees need clarity about how technology will affect them, how their lives can be bettered by technology, and human connection is essential for transformation. So you have to guide employees, or the organizations have to guide employees in a conversant way by speaking to them about what is going to happen. So what is the main point? Inclusive change depends on integrating technology, incorrect, with skills. You have to, inclusive change depends on conversations. You have to say conversations, you have to say human connections. So D is invalid. Communication clarity is essential for aligning workforce behavior. Communication clarity is different from human connection, is different from conversation. Communication clarity just means me giving you the legal points. If you do this, if you don't train yourself in AI, you are fired. That's clarity, but that's not having a conversation, that's not having human connection. So C is incorrect. Essential for aligning workforce, this is invalid. B says organizational change succeeds when employees understand tools. Understanding of tools has been mentioned. Value the value proposition of new tools must be communicated as discussed, but succeeds when they understand, no, succeeds when you have a human to human connection with them. This ensures human connection ensures, right? So B is incorrect. A is the right answer. Effective transformation balances data driven decisions with sustained human centered engagement. Effective because human connection will ensure, therefore, effective transformation needs sustained human centered engagement. A is the right answer. Question 62. We are looking for practical implications based on input 1. We had called the passage as input 1. Based on input 1, what action would a responsible state, what practical action would a responsible state take? India must allow multiple licensed. By the way, one thing that I want you to remember is throughout the entire passage section, you should not use your personal opinions or knowledge at all. You must rely on the passage. Now, in this passage, we know there's a lot of ongoing debate about how current nuclear policy expansion is. Is it good? Is it bad? Etc. We have to put all of that debate that we know outside of what we are trying to do here. We are not bringing our own knowledge in. The passage is talking about how single operator model has affected nuclear expansion in a negative way because there are budgetary constraints. NPCIL cannot add 100 gigawatts of capacity because it's impractical for them. उनसे existing projects ही खत्म नहीं हो रहे. That's what the passage is saying. The scale required for 100 gigawatts would demand organizational capacity beyond NPCILs, right? Beyond NPCIL. So that means India must allow multiple licensed operators. to execute reactors projects in parallel. चाहे वो public sector हो या joint sector हो या private हो, we need beyond NPCI. So, based on input one, this is why I'm calling this as input one. I'm not using my own ideas, I'm using the passage as input. So, based on input one, I can say a responsible state will take this action. Nuclear expansion targets should be aligned with demonstrated institutional execution capacity. So, you should align those targets with demonstrated institutional execution. मतलब वो prove कर चुके हैं कि they can execute this rather than headline capacity. So you should not just say, oh, we have capacity to generate XYZ, give us the project. You should have demonstrated it before. Experience. So 1 and 2 are valid. 3 says dedicated financing mechanisms to reduce NPCL dependency needed. 3, I expect everyone to realize that it's a valid answer because budgetary constraint is discussed first and foremost. So 1, 2, 3 are valid. Many of you would have gone with option B here. Let's check 4. Project management and construction should be made accountable and structurally decentralized. So many of you who have studied practical implication questions with me will know that we are acting as the state here. But you may think that uh, structurally decentralized is a problem, especially project management and construction. But we are told the scale required would demand organizational capacity which is beyond NPCI. They can't execute this. They don't have the ability to execute it. So you have to decentralize it. If you want to grow it, you have to decentralize it. There's no option based on the input given in the passage. So 1, 2, 3, 4 are valid. There's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 says foreign reactor partnerships should focus on delivery, etc. So 5 is invalid. B is the correct answer here. All right. We're looking for inferences and passage is fairly easy. Public sector organizations continue to face foundational challenges because they're not ready for data. The changes that data brings, when I say not ready for data, they're not ready to uh, use data. They're not ready to use AI systems because of whatever reasons across departments. Data security is a problem across departments. Without robust infrastructure metrics, AI remains confined to isolated pilots. So we are told why, because of data security issues and foundational issues, AI adoption has suffered. Okay, so passage is mostly about AI adoption. What you want to remember is the moment, now you don't know this yet, you'll only know this when you start seeing options 1, 2, 3, 4. But the moment you get data like this, which is 26%, more than half, most governments, 52%, you quickly read through it. You don't try to, what I didn't mention, by the way, those of you who have done classes with me will know. We never read the passage to memorize it. The passage is in front of us. We revisit it and check everything, right? So I'm not memorizing this data, but for each option, I'll have to go back and check it carefully. Most public sector organizations currently lack infrastructure prerequisites required for enterprise-wide AI deployment. Now, I know one has caused the most amount of problems. Students have gone with either option A or B, especially option B. The problem here is what are infrastructure prerequisites is unknown from the passage. It's an inference question. I need some evidence to know what are infrastructure prerequisites. Do I need, like, what systems do I need? So, most public sector organizations currently lack infrastructure prerequisites. No such prerequisites discussed in the passage. So, one is invalid. This is crucial. Noticing and searching for this is crucial. One is invalid. So maybe you can say, like, let's say unified enterprise data warehouse, cloud-based infrastructure, mm, tools to effectively monitor. But I don't know if these are all the prerequisites. These are some of the prerequisites. These are few of the prerequisites. Are they even prerequisites? So these are all unknowns to me. Even though three things which are required are discussed, we don't know if they are some, all, etc. So one is invalid. This phrase is, so we are conflating data. We are combining data incorrectly here. Incorrect conflation of data. One is invalid. Two says the absence of unified data architecture is statistically more prevalent than absence of cloud-based information. Now, if you notice, only 26% operate cloud-based infrastructure. So this means 74% is absent. 74% is absent than absence of cloud-based infrastructure. So, one second. Absence of unified data structure, which is this, which is more than half, so let's say 55%, we'll say, is statistically less prevalent than 74%. Right? So, in short, this phrase should have been less prevalent, not more prevalent. So, 1 and 2 are invalid. I think question 63 is probably one of the hardest questions in today's paper. Not conceptually, but because of the way the options are presented, options 1, 2, and 3 especially. Option 3 says most governments that have adopted cloud infrastructure are able to track performance. So most governments are able to track performance, goes against the passage. 3 is invalid. 4 says in more than half of public sector organizations, AI initiatives cannot be reliably evaluated. 52% are unable to quantify return on investment. So more than half cannot evaluate. 4 is valid. Even among governments experimenting with AI, institutional mechanisms are frequently missing that justify scaling decisions. So without robust infrastructure metrics, AI remains confined. So 5 tells me that even where governments are experimenting, it's confined to isolated pilots. So D is the correct answer for question 63. If you've gotten, so I think 2 questions in the exam can be considered very difficult, not based on language, but not based on the difficulty of the language of the passage, but based on how we are asked to go through or navigate through the options. D is the right answer here. All right, let's take a look at question 70 on crux, means main point of the author. We are told ecological myopia interprets climate change as conventional problem. Myopia means short-sightedness rather than planetary one. It assumes climate sits in a box. So even if you didn't understand the first sentence, assumes climate sits in a box is clear enough for us. The author is suggesting a new approach, political geoecology, which sees politics as inseparable from the Earth's ecosystem. They cannot be separated because modern societies are built into Earth. So the main point should talk about these ideas, like I said, some recommendation, some new idea, some solution mentioned by the author. A says climate change should be managed through environmental policy frameworks, not the main point, not the crux of the author. D says modern societies depend primarily on ecological resource. No mention of. We need either this phrase or the definition of this phrase in the ideal main point or crux. C says political geoecology, so it's mentioned, replaces sustainability as a model. So replaces sustainability, invalid. The author says uh, could be a valid way, but not replacing sustainability. So C is invalid. B says separating ecology from politics obscures. This makes it unclear about the planet's uh, overall impact on the planet. So B is the right answer. Fairly easy question. 72 is called a sentence completion or para completion question type. We are expected to complete this question, this sentence, based on the information given in the passage. So first we figure out the passage. This is a non-standard question type. Land is degraded due to poor land use, especially because of agricultural land. 60% of this is caused due to agricultural land. Okay. And it undermines agriculture. So we are told agricultural expansion continues to drive, etc. So the negative impact of land management, especially agricultural land management. The passage suggests that prevailing land use practices are resulting in expansion driven food production that offsets ecological stress, that reduces ecological stress. So this is offsets ecological stress is invalid. Uh, what you want to remember for this type of a statement completion or para completion kind of a statement, UPSC has asked this question type twice where they leave a sentence incomplete. Remember, for this question, you always read the sentence like this and then read the option each time. So the passage suggests that prevailing land use practices are resulting in intensifying pressure on soil and water resources that remains compatible. Invalid. The passage suggests that prevailing land use practices are resulting in a reallocation of environmental stress between agricultural and land nature ecosystems without systemic decline. Reallocation invalid, without systemic decline invalid. But if I say the passage suggests that prevailing land use practices are resulting in widespread ecological degradation that is simultaneously weakening long term resilience, is valid. So, the important thing I wanted to remember from question 72 is read the full statement and then read the option. Do this for each option and then try to see which matches the passage. A is the correct answer. All right. With reference to the passage, we are making assumptions is the same passage that we read right now. Unsustainable agricultural practices are a primary driver. This is a quantifying word or phrase that needs checking. So, uh, degraded due to poor land use management, more than 60% of this degradation is because of agricultural land. So, agricultural practices are a primary driver. This is a valid assumption based on 60%, right? So they are a primary driver. One is valid. Two says increased cultivated area can reduce the net productivity loss. What can reduce the net productivity loss? Not discussed in the passage. Two is invalid. A is the correct answer for question 73. All right, that's it from me. I just want to mention a few points for all of you all. One is that in our classes, which are still ongoing, we are actually covering all these question types really carefully. I have mentioned them carefully enough in today's discussion. So please go back to those parts, pause them, listen to those again in case you have any issue with it. Remember that being methodical, meaning going through everything in a stepwise fashion and understanding what inferences, assumptions specifically need, but especially being methodical is going to guarantee accuracy. In passages, the method is imposed by us. A student can solve a passage in their own way or using my method, but being methodical, going stepwise, assures us of accuracy. All right. All the best, and I'll see you next time.